Hello. Thank you all for being here, and warm thanks to Verso Libros for organizing this conference and bringing us all together. It's a really important occasion when there's fewer and fewer pan-European conferences and so forth to be able to be here. We're going to be discussing capitalism today. Capitalism in an age of financial crises met by bailouts, enormous state bailouts, which then create further vulnerabilities, asset price inflation, risky lending, and the need for further bailouts. An age of accelerating digital technological development, penetrating every aspect of daily life. An age of accelerating climate crisis, exceeding the model's predictions. And an age of growing geopolitical tensions, themselves driven in part by the globalization of production, in an attempt to solve the profitability problems of Western firms, which in fact fueled the rise of China. So an age in which every solution to capitalist crisis seems to be creating further vulnerabilities. To debate these questions, we have two thinkers who work at the forefront of these issues. Cédric Durand, born in France, educated in Grenoble and at the EHSS in Paris, who did his PhD on mining in post-Soviet Russia, and is probably best known for his two recent books, Fictitious Capital, which appeared in 2014, examining the dynamics behind the financial crisis, and Tecnofeudalisme, examining those of the digital revolution, which appeared in 2020. And with us also is Evgeny Morozov, who was born in the Minsk area of the Soviet Union just 7 years before it disintegrated. Educated at the American University in Bulgaria and with a PhD from Harvard, whose first book, The Net Delusion, was an extraordinarily prescient account or prescient demolition of dreams that the digital age would bring democratization. Both of my comrades here have been engaged in a debate in New Left Review. I would say that Cédric's Tecnofeudalisme book perhaps formed the catalyst for this. Evgeny then replied with a really landmark critique of techno-feudalism. So we're going to be discussing all these issues today. I'm going to ask Cédric to begin by telling us, what do you think are the novel dynamics of the conjuncture?
Thank you, Suzanne. Good night, everybody. Very happy to be here to discuss with you. So I would characterize the current conjuncture reusing a concept by Ernest Mandel and talking about too late capitalism. Too late capitalism. Why too late? I think the most obvious reason is the ecological crisis and the threat it represents for the planet in general and our species in particular. And this is really in the background of all the debate we should have. I think that's something absolutely crucial. But if you want to focus more on the capitalist dynamic itself, if you want to characterize its situation now, I think that there are five elements that are absolutely key. The first element is the rise of the rest. There is a form of de-Westernization of the global economy, in the sense that the hegemony of the US and Europe, to much more clearly, is fading away in the face of the rise of China and, to a lesser extent, other countries, including India and mostly India. And here, just to give you one number, China was about 3% of global GDP in the 80s. It's more than 18% in PPP today. So it's really tremendous, and it changed the whole dynamics. France and Germany was 10% of global GDP. It's 5% now. It's less than India together. So I think it gives you a magnitude of the change, and I think that's really something that is super important to understand what's going on now. The second important element of the conjuncture is what I would call, maybe it's a little bit premature, but the end of financial hegemony. We had 5 completely crazy decades of financial development with a huge, what economists call super cycle. And that super cycle was more or less functional, not that much, but up to 2008 was able to function on its own energy, in large part, but after 2008, it has been completely subsidized. And we have had huge bailout, huge intervention by central banks, and those many interventions have their own problem. And I think that the COVID crisis and the inflation burst after that showed that it was more and more difficult to manage this economy that is not very dynamic, but a financial sector that is booming and booming. And I think that this huge weight of fictitious capital, this huge weight of finance, is something that is really weighing on the current conjuncture, and it's a crisis that is always there. It's always, if you follow the financial news very closely, every month, 2 months, you are hearing about some crisis in that corner, some intervention in that other corner. And now we have a lot of debates about money, the place of the dollar, the rise of crypto and stable coins, and all of that is part of this crisis of financial hegemony, I would say. So that will be the second stylus fact. The third element that I think is very important, of course, is the hegemony of tech. And we will talk about that tonight a lot. But just to put the emphasis on something. It's not only a new sector that is leading capital accumulation, but it's a sector that is super heavily concentrated. And just a few corporations represent about 20% of market capitalization in the US, about 35% of stock market capitalization in the US, while it was about 20% the top big firms, some up till 2010. So there is a very rapid, not only growth of that sector, but also concentration of capital accumulation in a few corporations. So that's something that is very, very special. The fourth element is globalization. We have experienced globalization in many aspects of our life, ability to travel for some of us, but all the goods that we are consuming are produced in all parts of the world. But it seems that since something like 10, 15 years, globalization has stopped to expand. The weight of global trade in the global economy is not increasing anymore. And now we have a lot of conversation vis-à-vis tariffs, vis-à-vis decoupling. We have a lot of sanctions. So there is a process of fragmentation of the global economy that is something also very different from the classical neoliberal era. And finally, and I think that's also something that will be very important in our debate tonight, is the fact that too late capitalism is also a capitalism that has lost its dynamism. It's not a dynamic capitalism, it's a slowing capitalism. It has been slowing since the big boom of the post-war era, but there has been no rejuvenation in spite of the development of the tech sector. There is less investment in high-income economies, and now we have a slowdown that is not only in high-income economy, but that's also the case in China. We have a slowdown for about a decade that is clear now. And it's not only that slowdown of the economy in general, of investment, but that's also the fact that in spite of all that innovation, in spite of the tech everywhere, productivity is very low, it's very sluggish. It's not more efficient. We are not producing more use value in that sense. And maybe many people are feeling that there is some forms of impoverishment that are linked to that slowing dynamic of capitalism. So I think those 5 elements, the development of other countries, especially China, the fact that financial hegemony is reaching its limits, the fact that tech is taking a prominent role in a very concentrated way, that globalization is slowing down, and that moreover capitalism is losing its dynamics, can help to understand what's going on now. That's the landscape when we are talking. And I think that it's very important to have that in mind when we think about the reactionary turn that we are observing in many Western countries now, especially, of course, in the US with this, I don't want to qualify it too much, but at least authoritarian, to some extent, maybe neo-fascist turn in the US, but everywhere else there is a very reactionary authoritarian component that is linked to this specific conjuncture where you have more international competition, you have less social dynamic in terms of capacity of improving living standards, where you have more concentration of power, of economic power. All those elements are the background of the conjuncture, I will say.
Thank you. Evgeny, what would you say to that or add to it?
A lot. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful festival. I guess I've taken some notes as Cédric was speaking, so I will try to address some of the points he made while also making some of my own. Much in both Susan's framing of this and in Cédric's response revolves around 2008 and the crisis and the aftermath that followed being something of a turning point, how we periodize and how we think about the shape that capitalism has today. I think it's largely true, and it's probably even truer for the way the tech economy works and how it has evolved. It's enough to look just at how Uber, Airbnb, and many similar firms have managed to position themselves in the aftermath of that crisis as helping the middle classes to deal with the aftermath by becoming entrepreneurs or making sure that their assets like cars or houses can have a second lease on life, so to say. But I also think that there is a tendency in that periodization in also distracting us from some of the processes that started earlier and from maybe looking at slightly different set of issues and dimensions in I would think about capitalism. So since Cédric framed his intervention as a contribution to articulating what this too late capitalism might be, I might say that I have actually over the years become extremely critical and skeptical of the periodization that takes late capitalism as a departure point to begin with. And I think to some extent, for all my respect for Ernst Mandel, that has also imposed a lot of analytical constraints on the left's ability to think about structural changes in capitalism since 1970s. Because that periodization assumes that after we've been through the liberal state of capitalism and we've been through the monopoly state of capitalism, we've arrived to late capitalism, 1970s, which to some extent marks the beginning of globalization, and all the other changes that happen afterwards, we need to find some other way to talk about them by introducing concepts like neoliberalism or financialization or globalization to be able to take note of this changing morphology of capitalism, if you will. I've been working, but publishing much about it for the last decade or so on trying to come up with a slightly different periodization, which moves from the old idea that Hilferding and many others were articulating 100 years ago of organized capitalism. Its transition to disorganized capitalism in the 1970s, more or less marked by the rise of deregulation and privatization and the establishment of competition as a kind of organizing way of governing the world, to its ultimate exhaustion in the early 2000s and the emergence of what I've been calling organic capitalism, which is a very different kind of beast, which to some extent acknowledges that the efforts to discipline the states and companies by subjecting them to more competition and more marketization and privatization that marked the period from 1970s to the late 1990s have failed and have generated a lot of problems of their own, including, by the way, climate change, but also inequality and a host of other issues, and the mobilization of more capital to actually deal with those problems. So from early 2000s onwards, and you can see it clearly in the advocacy of people like Al Gore and others, we do see a slightly different rationale emerging within the leading sectors of the capitalist economy, which basically acknowledges that capitalism has not been as terrific as Friedrich Hayek and many others have been arguing, that it has produced a lot of externalities, but by mobilizing more capital and by mobilizing more, if you will, market-driven political interventions, we can actually fix some of those problems. So you can see that the entirety of like what asset managers have been doing with regards to climate change has more or less operated in that paradigm, where the thinking was that we can actually impose market discipline on companies and have them go and achieve good objectives when it comes to governance, when it comes to environmental performance, and so forth. Silicon Valley, to some extent, enters this through the concept of what I've been calling solutionism, because they themselves have been on the frontier lines of offering solution to every single problem that capitalism itself has generated. And you can clearly see it from 2010s onwards with the proliferation of solutions to everything in the healthcare sphere, in the education sphere, in transportation, and virtually every single sphere of life. Silicon Valley has positioned itself as the provider of ultimate efficient solutions to every single problem under the sun, which for a long time the general public actually accepted without contesting it, without seeing that it was actually just another way of smuggling the privatization and marketization paradigms through the back door, but calling it digitization or innovation. Within that form of new capitalism, if you will, organic one, and the reason why I call it that is that it has essentially tried to do politics through the market. So it tried to opt for market-based institutions, whether they're based in platforms or they're based somewhere else, to mobilize them and to subject them to some kind of logic of profitability and accumulation, and to make sure that it's through them that you manage to resolve a lot of the problems that the rest of capitalism has produced in its wake. And that's, by the way, I think why, if you have followed the debates in Davos in the last decade or 15 years, they're quite clear that they accept that climate change is real. They were more than happy to accept that there were more and more problems in the world that needed to be solved, but they would all be solved in the framework of mobilizing private capital, sidelining the form of any political non-market institutions, and turning essentially the capitalist economy into the ultimate problem solver. So for me, that would be one of the kind of structural features of the capitalist landscape that are very easy to miss if we start with a more conventional periodization. And I can talk to you about how each of these paradigms have exhausted themselves, but we don't really have time here because we also need to get to Tecnofeudalism. The part that I think is interesting is that this has led to not the exhaustion of finance or the finance industry. So in that sense, I don't agree with Cédric. It has led to actually a very interesting intertwinement of Wall Street and Silicon Valley, because both of them in different ways represent different sides of this organic capitalist solutionist coin, where Silicon Valley pitches itself as the provider of solutions, but those solutions, especially in as much as they rely on artificial intelligence, require massive capital investments. They require, at least in its current form, data centers. They require all sorts of new AI models to be built and trained. And we are talking about just this year, I think the amount of money pledged by the top 4 or 5 big tech firms to essentially R&D and capital expenditures somewhere in the range of 250 or something billion. Now, you have to understand where that money comes from. Some of that comes from their sizable cash reserves, but some of that comes from them striking deals with sources of idle capital in the Gulf states, in Qatar, in the Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Some of that comes from them tapping into brand new segments of the global economy, including private credit, which represents probably one of the most understudied segments of the global economy today, which involves a new set of players that do not resemble private equity or venture capital or asset managers, which essentially bypass the markets altogether. So in this, I think, if I were to mark structural features of this new landscape the way Cédric did, I would actually point to the decline of the publicly traded company and the stock market as the provider of ultimate discipline, and its replacement by a lot of private decision-making happening in institutions like asset managers, which do deal primarily with publicly traded companies, but also a completely new set of players operating in private credit. So even a company like Facebook, which has plenty of cash and doesn't really need to raise money to build its latest data centers, has just embarked on massive tapping into private credit markets, borrowing something like 22, 28 billion to build data centers, just announced a couple of weeks ago. That does lead to new sets of vulnerabilities, but I do think that we need to think about finance and tech as existing in a mutually reinforcing relationship, and not seeing the rise of the hegemony of tech as a phenomenon that's somehow stands outside of the continued relevance of Wall Street, and particularly new players on Wall Street that are very different from the Goldman Sachs and the BlackRocks and the Blackstones of the world, and the way in which it does produce new systemic vulnerabilities. Beyond that, I think we have to understand that there is a massive ideological underside to all of this, with Silicon Valley and people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel from slightly different angles capturing the imaginary of what future and progress look like, and forcing, or not yet forcing, but hopefully forcing, movements and parties on the left come up with an alternative imaginary. I haven't seen that happen, but I think it would be a mistake for us not to think about these new players as not just providers of solutions and privatized and market-based solutions, but also as sources of potent imagery about what the future of politics and public life would be. And by and large, if you follow the debates in the United States in the past few months, you would not fail to see that that future does not really involve democracy as we understand it. So there will be some public life and there will be some associational life, but it will be one that will be hyper-technological, mediated by all sorts of reputation systems and tracking devices and facial recognition systems and drones and whatever else is being built in Palantir, but it would not involve traditional democratic forms of association. And that, I think, that ideological underside is something that we also need to contend with as we are thinking about how this new system legitimates itself. Maybe I'll stop here and we'll come back to some of it later.
Thanks. Could I just ask you to follow through there on a couple of points?
Sure.
Are you suggesting that these new forces are going to be able to keep pace with the vulnerabilities and the sort of new crises that they're producing? Mm-hmm. Are they going to sort of keep ahead, or do you see a sort of catastrophe not far ahead?
Well, I mean, I see catastrophe in that we've been living through that catastrophe for the last 5 or 6 decades, right? And probably in a much more intense form in the last 2 or 3 decades. But I don't see capitalists losing control and losing the plot, if that's what you're asking. So it will be a very turbulent time, but I don't really see any contending force on the horizon able to wrest control out of them, right? So in that sense, I also think that the entire turn towards AI in the past few years, and particularly in the past 12 months, has managed to revitalize the capitalist imagination in ways that probably we have not seen for a very long time. So it has also managed to mobilize a lot of idle capital that was previously going into real estate or just pure financial speculation. Even the companies that have been relatively kind of resting on their laurels, like if you look at Apple, for example. So, I mean, obviously Apple has been one of the largest buyers of its own stock, right? And they've invested something like 30 billion while they spent 110 billion on buying their own shares. Now you can actually see how some of that is hurting them because their spending was definitely less than that of Google and Amazon and all the others are actually doing much better in AI. Right? So in that sense, the wave of, to use the old-fashioned term, productive capital investment driven by the expectations that AI is going to cut costs, result in completely new areas of business and new profit lines, I think it's not fictitious. I mean, it's real in that it's going to buy these firms and this, if you will, alliance of Wall Street and Silicon Valley another 5 or 7 years, if not more, of being able to burn a lot of cash. So OpenAI does not expect to be profitable until 2029, 2030. They will be burning tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions, not just burning, I mean, they're already burning that much. They will be losing tens of billions a year for quite a while, but their ability to convince both governments who are essentially subsidizing them a lot by letting them build data centers and also lending them some of the money through sovereign wealth funds and everything else, their ability to build a coherent narrative out of it, despite it being highly irrational and wasteful because all of these firms are building the same kind of functionality. I mean, so in that sense, it's a highly irrational system, which within the current capitalist dynamic will probably last for 5 or 7 years, and things might get much worse on the political front in the meantime. So the discontent that might emerge otherwise about data centers and their wasteful energy consumption might just be managed through sheer force and not through needing to buy people in through promises of a nice future.
Thanks. Cédric, do you want to reply to that and then maybe talk about your ideas of technofeudalism as well?
Yeah, maybe one point concerning the relationship between Wall Street and the tech sector. I agree with Morozov that there is a lot of connection and that, of course, the tech sector is mobilizing financial capital or either public capital, either bank capital, either private capital, as you have stressed, and that there are a lot of mutation in the financial sector. That's perfectly true. My point is that the financial sector has lost its autonomy in the sense that it's heavily depending on the intervention by central banks. And this heavy intervention by central banks is generating more and more tension, specifically regarding the question of inflation. You had a burst of inflation, and right now, again, in the US, you have some uptick in inflation while the central bank is diminishing its interest rate. That means that you have a situation where it's more and more difficult to preserve the value of money while preserving the position of finance. And I think this is a big contradiction. On the other hand, the tech sector is proposing, and what you have described is perfectly exact, I would say, with the AI and more broadly with an imaginary and practices also, it's really driving society at large, investment in particular, economic behavior. So that's the leading factor. That's in that sense that I am talking about a shift from finance being the leading sector to tech being the leading sector. And that's, of course, there is no disjunction, everything is organic, but the leadership is on the tech side. And it's in that context that I developed the hypothesis of technofeudalism. And this hypothesis, I am kind of surprised how it's working well. You know, when we, in January, remember in January, when we have seen all those tech bosses that were coming to the inauguration of Trump, that was a very striking moment. You had that picture, all the techs were there, they were on the first rank, and he was just around. And the first day, what decided Trump? He decided to scrap any kind of regulation regarding AI at the federal level. So that was a very important decision because it was opening any kind of state supervision of their of the point where they were making the most of their bets and attempts. So it's in this sense, it's capturing something, I would say. But at a more analytical level, I would like to precise maybe some elements. The first thing is that, of course, Tecnofeudalism is not meaning that the digital economy is bringing us back to the feudal times. Of course, that's not that. And there is one huge difference, and very important, of course, is that in medieval times, the work, the organization of production was very individualized. That the peasants were working for the Lord, of course, but they were working most of the time individually. On the contrary, we are living today in a highly socialized production system. All corporations are depending on each other. But just think, you here in this place, how many people were involved in the things that we are using now? It's completely unimaginable. So that's a completely different world. However, there are some similarities in terms of quality of social relations that are developed at three levels, I would say. The first is dependency. We are not depending on tech services on our everyday life, each of us. I used to say that my mom probably can live without Google, but she had a problem with her phone 1 month ago, and she asked a neighbor and called me, and that was really an emergency. She needed a smartphone because she was not able to handle her life. So even my mom, which is 84 years old, now needs absolutely Google too. So we really are all of us are depending on that. But that's not just a question of our individual life in every dimension. I think I don't have to detail here. That's also all the corporations, all the state activities are relying on big tech services. Just to take some example in Europe, recently the German, it was in last November, the German Interior Ministry made an agreement with Amazon for its cloud. We have also, the main banks in Europe are depending on cloud services provided by the US. The French National Railway firm is also using cloud from Amazon. It used to have its own proprietary cloud, but it just outsourced that service. Total, you know, the energy firm, the CEO of Total explained to the press that he's very embarrassed because he has to send to the US all the data that he has about geological perspective to get some oils. And he's not very happy about that because he don't really trust that his data will be protected. So there is really a general dependency, not only of ourselves, individuals, but all the whole productive structure on those tech services that are heavily centralized in very few corporations. And this dependency is something very, very important. I think that's a side point, but important, that new form of colonialism are developed here. You have a form of dependency, you have a center, you have a periphery, you have highly asymmetrical relations that are really waiting on the future of Europe and many other countries, of course. So dependency will be the first analogy, if you want, with the feudal times. Because in feudal times, the peasants were completely dependent on the Lord. They were attached to the land of the Lord. Their entire life was dependent on the relationship with the Lord. So we have this same kind of dependency, I would say. The second argument is related to there has been always some kind of articulation between the political realm and the economic realm in capitalism. Capitalist firms wait on state decisions. They are lobbying a lot all the time. That's not something new. But what is new is that those big tech are now taking key state capabilities under their power. And that has been, I think, very clear at one point. That was just an anecdote, but I think that was very telling. During COVID, Google made public mobility data. So we were able to know wherever people are going in town, what's going on, and things like that. But in 2023, they closed that public access, and it became private again. This key statistic that is in the hand of Google is not at our disposal. Our we citizens, but also the state. And that's the case for many statistics. Many statistics are now made by those big tech, and they are very useful for organizing political life. And right now in the US, there is a lot of debate because with Trump is meddling with statistics agency, so people begin not to trust the statistic anymore, and they will rely more and more on private statistics, which is a key aspect of the state power, the infrastructural power of the state, if you want. But there are other examples. Another example is, of course, the organization of the public life, of the debate. We know that it's highly curated on those social networks. The way that the algorithm of Facebook or of Twitter are organizing political life are not neutral at all. It used to be mostly regulated by the state. That's not the case anymore. A third example is more frontier, but that's related to the status of money. You know, we have a lot of debate regarding the role of the dollar right now. That's something very hot. And there is a loss of trust in the dollar that we can trace in some outflow from the US in the past months. But in the meantime, we have the rise of new form of money. That's crypto, of course, but crypto in itself exists for a long time, and it would not have been able to go further. But the regulation is changing. And now big firms like Amazon, like X, like Walmart also, are beginning to think about issuing their own money. And when they will be able to issue their own money, which is coming in the coming months or years at most, you will have monetary power that will be in the hand of those firms, which will mean less ability of state power to manage their economy and to have some kind of macroeconomic policy. So those elements are showing, in my view, that key aspects of state capacities are shifting from the public sector to the private sector. And in that sense, they are becoming more and more political actors, not in abstract, in general, in terms of lobbying, but in really organizing social life. And finally, the last aspect, I think it's also important, it's the idea that what they are doing most of all is that they are building predatory position to be able to extract rent. And in that sense, you have a form of analogy with feudal times. In feudal times, the lords were ruling over the land, they were making decisions, they were acquiring the income, but they were also attempting to expand their realm in a zero-sum game. And we have the same kind of zero-sum game between the big tech. The big tech are generalists now. They used to be different corporations. Amazon was selling books, Google was a search engine, and now Facebook was a social network. Now all those firms are building the same kind of general capabilities to manage knowledge through their cloud services. And they are competing between each other very harshly, of course, but they are competing between each other not in a positive game, but in a zero-sum game. What one is winning, the other are losing in that sense. They are expanding the control of the social sphere by those investments. And I think the key point here is that Evgeny is right to underscore the fact that they are investing a huge amount of cash. That's really extraordinary. But that's a sectoral dynamic that we are looking at here. If you look at the economy more broadly, you do not have any kind of investment rush. There is no increase in investment in general, which means that more investment in the tech means less investment in other places. Less investment for public services, of course, but also in other capabilities, manufacturing capabilities, infrastructure for everyday life, housing, etc., etc. Which means that you have a kind of predatory dynamics here, I think. And that's the reason why I think we can speak about technofeudalism not being here, but being a trend that is materializing every day. Maybe just a final note. I'm not saying that there is any kind of necessity of technofeudalism to arise. Technofeudalism is a possibility that is materializing right now in the West. But in China, we have something different. I will not try to clarify that now, but the state is not allowing those firms to drive, take control of the political process and to dominate the functioning of society at large. So I think that there is no necessity. That's the result of some political choices that have been made, that are made nowadays. But there are other possibilities, of course, with the tech. There is no necessity with tech. There could be another tech, I would say, in brief.
Thanks. Evgeny, do you want to respond to that and to the possibility of China having a different model?
Sure. Well, first of all, we have to realize that there are many partly overlapping and partly competing theories and accounts of technofeudalism and neo-feudalism, which is a kind of a related cognate concept. So the version that Cédric offers is probably the most nuanced and the one that does not present it as an exhaustive or at least exclusive account of what drives change under capitalism. So it's one of the, in his framing, it's one of the explanatory frameworks that complements the dynamics that are exhibited by financialization or and globalization as, for example, two contending phenomena that can explain what's going on. So there are, of course, much more populist ways to think about it and to frame it, and the most probably well-known one will be that of Yanis Varoufakis, where there are claims that are much more absolute and that are much more definitive, with capitalism dying in 2008 and a new system emerging and profit being being completely replaced by rent. So there is a much more populist, I would say, reading of technofeudalism. In my remarks now, I will kind of straddle, I guess, the middle ground and occupy the middle ground between both of those more extreme populist and more nuanced versions. My immediate response to Cédric, in listening to you, Cédric, I got the feeling that you seem to imply that a theory of capitalism in Marx and Marxism at least is by extension also a theory of the state and of the form that it should take and what functions the state should occupy. Maybe this would have been the content of the missing volume that Marx had been conceptualizing about the state, but that volume didn't reach us. And as far as we know, a theory of capitalism is agnostic about the form of the state and the exact distribution of labor between the market and the state. That's at least my reading of capital. From that end, the idea that now some of these firms are taking on functions that were previously occupied by the welfare state, and earlier were occupied by charities, and even earlier were occupied by beneficiaries and, you know, the Medicis and whoever. I mean, it's interesting, but to me, it doesn't really say anything about whether we're living in capitalism or feudalism. It just tells us that there is a plasticity of sorts in terms of how various needs related, for example, to reproduction can be fulfilled and satisfied within the format of the capitalist state. In my own theory and periodization, there is nothing abnormal about more and more governments delegating responsibility, because I think it's happening, fully sanctioned, approved, and encouraged by governments, delegating more and more responsibility over healthcare, education, or issuance of money to the private sector in Silicon Valley, because ultimately, in my view of the world, it's a way for them to accomplish several goals at once. One of which is to create and maintain conditions for capitalist accumulation so that despite all of the systemic problems that capitalism has run into, capitalist firms can still continue accumulating somehow. And partly it's a way of fulfilling many of the needs that they have when it comes to policing, when it comes to provision of healthcare and whatnot. So something like, you know, Palantir entering the defense industry or entering the, policing, it's not in any way an impingement on the prerogatives of the state. It's a way, to some extent, of deepening the reach of it and doing it slightly differently, but nonetheless, still keeping the state and its institutions as part of the picture. Now, my beef with the theory of technofeudalism is that it indirectly sidesteps or makes less relevant other existing approaches and frameworks, including those within Marxism, that problematize questions related to imperialism and to the competition between, well, not the competition, but the dynamics between the hegemon in the global economy, which has been for almost a century, the United States, and the rest of the world, by substituting that lens with another lens, which basically looks at how power is distributed between states in the abstract and companies in the abstract. Right? And I think that, and we've heard some of that from Cédric, where the analysis essentially is based on understanding how the balance of power changes between states and governments, states and companies. And I think it's fine, but it fundamentally misses the fact that not all states are alike in the current global system, and that the American state deserves to be analyzed with a very different set of tools, because ultimately it's the hegemon, and it sets the tone in which the rest of the global economy and all of the countries, maybe with a slight exception of China, have to dance to its tune. So in that sense, yes, we can talk about the effects of the privatization of money and the rise of stable coins and whatnot, but ultimately, if you look at the Genius Act, which they just passed this year, it's very clear what the Trump administration wants with the stable coins. It's a way of entrenching and preventing any contestation of the hegemony of the dollar, which is contested, and there is more and more trade done in other currencies, and BRICS have done a lot to that effect. But ultimately, the entire intention of the Trump's foray into the crypto area is to make sure that more or less everything happening in crypto with stable coins has to be backed by US Treasuries, short-term securities issued by the US government or the US dollar. So it's a way of basically preventing the further sliding away of the US financial hegemony, doing it in a very clever way by mobilizing the private industry to help them, but it's ultimately a state-driven project. In that sense, it's very hard for me to look at what's happening now and invoke technofeudalism, which does not even presuppose the existence, if you think about traditional feudalism, of the modern state with all of its dynamics and competing interests. Beyond that, the part that slightly bothers me is that the focus on technofeudalism as a concept, because of maybe the populist imperative built into it by the likes of Varoufakis, it highly personalizes issues which clearly need to be understood through a systemic lens. And to some extent, you even see or hear some of that in Cédric's remarks, where he talked about his mother being dependent on Google and comparing it to the way in which peasants were dependent on the feudal lords. I would argue that it's a very different kind of dependency, because the dependency in this case is systemic. It's not dependency on Google, it's dependency on the fact that the entire modern society now expects you to be present online. You need to be present to have an online profile to apply for a job. You need to be basically doing things not because of desire of Eric Schmidt or Steve Jobs to force you to be using their services. It's because of the systemic pressure coming from some kind of invisible force. In that sense, the dependence that exists and has emerged is very much like the dependence of laborers and workers on the need to sell the labor power and the systemic pressure that originates from capitalist competition and capital, and not the personal dependence on the feudal lord, where you actually forced to be doing what you were doing by somebody with some kind of an arrow or a rifle in their hands. So in that sense, I don't see why us talking about dependence should necessarily lead us to conceptualizing it as feudalism, because the pressure in question is systemic and not personal. And there are many other fine nuances like this, where I think that situating it within the dynamic of capitalism would help us understand what's going on better. And maybe one last point I would like to make is that the bulk of Cédric's argument, which he didn't have time to go into, has to do also with the way in which intellectual property and all sorts of systemic factors, like their ability to control the supply chain, allows tech companies like Amazon and Google and others to wield their political power in a way that shields them off from the normal capitalist pressures and dynamics, and that it's no longer about capital and the pressures of capital as such, but rather it's about their ability to explore patents or loopholes in IP law with a kind of structural power that does not derive from market-based competition, which allows them to continue and deepen their accumulation. Is it more or less accurate, how I've been summarizing? Like some of, yeah? And here, again, I diverge and disagree because I think that ultimately what by and large prevents these firms from being contested, it's the sheer amount of capital that you would need to raise to contest them. And if somebody is prepared to go and mobilize that capital and survive all of the political and other battles that will ensue, that person will succeed. And we have seen that actually happen in the last few years with Elon Musk deciding that he really wants to be a big player in AI, going and forming a company called XAI, and essentially mobilizing $20 billion and burning through them maybe in 12 months, hiring the best talent that exists, building the most elaborate supercomputer that has probably existed until then, building it in 3 months as opposed to 2 years that experts thought it was going to take, and building Grok AI, which now suddenly is a contender to OpenAI, Claude, and Gemini. We can say whatever we want about Elon Musk, but to me, this is a classic example of a capitalist going and mobilizing capital, burning that capital, spending it wisely, and circumventing whatever bottlenecks, IP law, supply chains, and everything else that we think assures that these companies are undisruptible stood in the way, right? And that company is there. It basically results in OpenAI and others being forced to cut their prices because now Grok offers you AI that is much cheaper. And to me, it's a classical example of a capitalist entry dependent on the underlying capitalist being able to mobilize enough capital to enter an industry. So in that sense, yes, you can build a lot of barriers with IP. Yes, you can build a lot of barriers with political power. But ultimately, capital still remains the yardstick and the criterion by which you measure whether you succeed or not. And in that sense, I don't think we have departed from the logic of capital that has driven the capitalist economy for the last century or two.
Cédric, if I could put one of those, there's a lot of questions there, but if I could put one of them to you first. The absence of the state under feudalism is obviously a problem for the sort of techno-feudal analogy. Sovereignty is vested in the lord under pure feudalism. Once the absolutist state starts to arise, feudalism is sort of sapped. Towns start to grow and so forth. So how would you respond to that problem of the missing state in feudalism, using it as an analogy? Secondly, I guess, I mean, to put to you again, Evgeny's thing, that do we actually need feudalism here? We already have different forms of capitalist dependency and so forth. If feudalism is being evoked essentially as a rhetorical ploy, which obviously it's been, Varoufakis perhaps, or maybe Mélenchon or Yolanda Diaz is using it much more rhetorically than you're doing. Is it actually successful as rhetoric? I mean, don't we need to, as Evgeny was saying, to meet these new tech capitalists on the terrain of the future rather than evoking the sort of moral horrors of the past?
Thank you. So there is a lot to unpack, so I will just discuss those 2 points. So concerning the state, I think that's, of course, a very important point. And I'm always very careful in saying that I'm talking about a trend toward technofeudalism. I'm not saying that we were in feudalism until in capitalism until 2008, and suddenly we are in capitalism. By the way, we are not up till, I don't know, 19th century, and suddenly in 2 years we were in capitalism. That's a long process. So changes of mode of production are not occurring in one day. That's long processes. So my point is that state capacities are drastically altered in the past years at a reason that is very surprising, and this is questioning the position of the state. A side argument will be that, by the way, I don't really believe that will be successful. Because you have that trend toward technofeudalism, but they are not able to manage their competition between them. So the function of the state in capitalism, and that's very important for the state to play a role in controlling on some form the currency or statistics or the law, of course, is because it's regulating competition between capitals. If you do not have the mediation of the state, there is no way to regulate that competition. And I think that's what is going on now. So the question of the state will be in that term. We are observing a kind of weakening of the ability of the states to mediate competition between capitals, and those capitals are changing their rules. They are taking some forms of sovereignty. And sovereignty, and Evgeny is right in stressing that, there is, of course, a very important international dimension into that. And the US state is playing that game, but I'm not sure that by playing the game of using the tech sector to expand its capacity, or to try to maintain its hegemony, is not losing its own capacity to act as an autonomous state. And I think the question of the currency is absolutely key here. Of course, the reasoning of Besant and the US administration is to try to maintain the hegemony of the dollar in spite of the contradiction. So they try to invent a trick using stable coins. But we know that stable coins will generate a lot of financial instability. And when you will have a lot of financial instability, those various stable coins will be more or less reliable. And my bet is that some firms, big firms like Amazon or others, will have more stable coins than others. And their currency will be preferred against other currencies. And at that moment, we will see the emergence of a kind of autonomous monetary power. So that's the kind of mediation that I see. Concerning the second point, which is the rhetorical effect. So the way I enter into this technofeudal hypothesis was truly to try to analyze the problem that I had with globalization, financialization, stagnation, trying to make sense of that. And I went back to all structuralist reasoning about combination of social relation, and it was very helpful for me to try to imagine the way we have a reconfiguration and relation. So that's really analytical. But of course, I was aware of the rhetorical power of the term, and I also weighted the advantages and the inconvenience. And I think the advantages are very meaningful. Among the four advantages there are four main advantages, I will say. The first advantage is to just stress the fact that capitalism is not eternal. There is a history of capitalism. Capitalism is changing forms, is mutating, and we are heading toward a forms of end of capitalism in the sense that the socialization process that was analyzed early on by Marx, that is the very law of capital accumulation. The more capital accumulates, the more we are interdependent between us, the bigger are the means of controlling or organizing the labor process, and we are in that process. And the big tech, intellectual monopolization, centralization of knowledge is a hyper level of centralization. And stressing that, I think, is very important to imagine that there is a limit of the capitalist logic, and we are going in that direction. So stressing that historical movement was a way for me to also revive the left in the sense that we are not embedded in an eternal neoliberal capitalism, but history is going on, and that's what's going on now. A second element is also to stress the fact, and that's a kind of almost Benjaminian thing, is just to say that this movement of history is not necessarily a progress. And we have all, during the 90s, we have all this discourse very optimistic about tech, and you, Evgeny made a great job in debunking this idea of techno-solutionism and so on. But I think that the term also helped to stress that this kind of tech evolution could be regressive in many dimensions, in terms of inequalities, in terms of loss of democracy, in terms of loss of personal freedom. I think also that a third dimension that is interesting is more in relation to the structuration of the world economy. I think that something that is not enough underscored is that with the development of the tech sector and the general dependency of our economies to those services, there is a form of colonization of Europe. There is not only Latin America and Africa that are the periphery. Europe is the periphery right now. And the bills that we are paying to those tech companies each year is increasing very rapidly. Investment in the cloud, it's more bills for companies and society at large in Europe. So you have these forms of uneven exchange that is taking place, and putting out those kind of techno-feudal relation is also a way to frame that we need to think about an anti-techno-feudal front. And I think that there are some politics here that could be developed. And there are a lot of debates regarding digital sovereignty. I think it's also nurtured by this concept can help to make that debate more lively. And finally, I think that also thinking about technofeudalism is about a way to stress the fact that the diminishing state capacities and the fact that those big tech companies are taking control of state capacities is also a way to think about what kind of socialism we can think about. We cannot imagine any kind of socialism right now without state capacities. If states are not able to control infrastructure, if they are not able to control some forms of statistics apparatus, if they are not able to master their own administrative process, which is at stake now, I don't know how we can imagine socialization driven by democratic policies at the state level. So I think that also pointing out that there is a very existential threat about the possibility of having socialist policies using state apparatus is also very important to stress.
So do you see that as irrecuperable, the state, as a socialist tool?
So is it still capable? You mean? No.
Is it irrecuperable?
No, I don't think that it is irrecuperable. I think that I'm very Poulantzatian here. I would say that the state is a battlefield. We lost many positions, but in the past we won some. So I think it's still a field of fight. It's not necessarily, there is not eternal defeat. But if there is nothing more to win at the state level, that will be a very meaningful defeat.
Evgeny, do you want, most of the time this evening we've been discussing capital in its various forms. But Cédric has raised the question of labor and of socialism. Do you want to reply on that?
Sure. Can I just, I'll make a couple of points because I had some immediate responses to what Cédric was saying. So I find it very hard to look at the evolution of big tech from, say, late 2016 to 2025, and to think that somehow they have become more autonomous from the state, or they have accumulated more power to act autonomously. Let me remind you that the first time that the newly elected Trump in his first term passed a law that was this ban on Muslim countries and anybody from those countries coming to the US, you had people like Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, going to San Francisco airport to protest those measures. And that's a major tech billionaire in Silicon Valley. This is something that's completely unthinkable in 2025, where Sergey Brin would probably be, providing his services to drive those people to the airport to be deported. In that sense, I see this industry, including Mark Zuckerberg, who of course was seen as extremely antagonistic to Trump in the first administration, completely bending to the needs and imperatives of the second Trump administration. So I understand the hypothetical potential of Jeff Bezos creating stable coins that are going to take power away from the Federal Reserve. The reality is that a few months ago, Jeff Bezos, who owns Washington Post, said that, look, guys, we are going to fire all of our liberal left-leaning columnists, and we're just going to focus on discussing free markets and freedoms. Right? That's Jeff Bezos. And why did he do that? Because the climate in Washington has changed. So for me, in actual realpolitik terms, and not in hypothetical terms, Silicon Valley, through whatever mechanism, has been tamed, and partly because the distribution of labor within Silicon Valley has changed, and people like Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen and many others, including Trump's sons, have gained quite a lot of power that they didn't have, or didn't have to that extent in the first administration, and they have managed to bring the rest of the Silicon Valley with them. But right now, I would still describe Silicon Valley as mostly subservient to the Trump project and not representing any kind of autonomous potential departure from it. Beyond that, there was another point I wanted to make at a more abstract level, and that again has to do with what we've been discussing before about the state. Because listening to Cédric, again, I get this idea that there is a little bit of idealization of collective rationality of capitalists of the past in wanting to create stable, rational state institutions that would solve their own collective action problems. So it's as if they decided that they needed an independent statistics agency that would not be corroded by private power, so that agency came into existence. And now it's being threatened because something else has taken its place. I'm just not sure that I buy that idyllic account of capitalists being so smart and farsighted and insisting on this ideal state institutions to solve their own problems. Because everything that Marx tells us about capitalists is that in terms of systemic rationality, they're pretty dumb and short-sighted. And that they follow their own profit-making logic, and sometimes, of course, they manage to find figures and institutions that would solve some of those collective action problems, but that happens rarely, and it usually requires some drastic interventions, crisis, and whatnot. And in that sense, I don't see why capitalists would object to a private agency solving the problem of coordinations that they have when it comes to statistical knowledge, because that's what they've been doing with Standard & Poor's, Bloomberg, and many others who have been providing highly commodified private information to them for decades, and not a single capitalist has complained. Of course, we can argue that the data about roads is different than the data about financial markets, but I don't think that the capitalists would care whether they get the data from Google Maps or whether they get the data from some kind of cartographic agency of the state. So in that sense, my problem with the technofeudalist thesis and theory is that it projects certain features and qualities into both capitalism, and the state that I think were either non-existent or transitory and are not actually core parts or features of either capitalist state or capitalism as a system. And in that sense, it dabbles in some kind of nostalgia about productive capitalism now becoming unproductive that I also don't entirely buy. And that, to me, introduces a lot of costs and potential analytical traps, and I'm just not sure that the gains and the benefits of that analytic outweigh the potential costs and the real costs and the traps that we might fall into if we stick to it. Maybe I missed what Cédric was saying about labor, so I'm happy to answer that question, but what was the entry point into the labor?
I was talking about the dependency. There was this point about dependency, but just I ended by state capacities and socialism. Yeah. So I think that was that point you were referring to, the possibility of for socialism now, I would say. And so I was stressing the fact that diminishing state capacities is somehow structurally something that is bad for the prospect of socialism.
Oh, no. In that, I completely agree that, I mean, there is, it would, if we are engaging in this hypothetical speculation, of course it would be much better to be building socialism from the condition where the state is democratically controlled and partly co-opted by capitalists than if we are talking about some kind of a mix of a highly private fiefdom where, which, this tech bros do want to build on islands or seastats where everything is privatized, including the provision of everything. I mean, they've tried it with private cities in Honduras and elsewhere. So, I mean, there are existing templates, if you will, for how some of this private governance might happen. So if the idea, and there are people like Curtis Yarvin and others who would like to take it to the national and global state and make sure that it's not just private cities, but private nation states that would follow that logic. Of course, if you are talking about reconquering fully privatized nation states, the task is much harder from the perspective of any kind of socialism. So on that I agree, and that's why the current moment does matter, and it does matter to understand which parts of the state can still be defended, if you will. But I just think that just raising rhetorical points about the need to stop privatization or digitization or reverse the ecological cost of data centers and whatnot, it doesn't get us to articulating any kind of alternative vision that would be slightly more appealing than the vision of hyper-efficiency and the government being able to issue certificates in a minute rather than an hour or a day or a week than it takes now, that those and other kind of efforts led by Musk and Thiel have put in front of us or in front of Americans in the last few months, right? So in that sense, the problem, I think, on the left, it's not so much the lack of effort or desire to go back and reconquer some of these functions of the state. It's the inability to articulate a coherent political project that would match the utopian zeal of Silicon Valley, but would add a completely different emancipatory dimension, not necessarily because it will be realizable or realistic, but only because it would get the left out of being this mostly defensive, and I would even say in some cases reactionary force that just is there to defend the status quo that was achieved 30, 40, or 50 years ago, which by and large what most of current leftist posturing amounts to.
Cédric, what do you think?
No, I think that's very true, and we really need to be up to the task to try to imagine or at least propose some venue to think about alternative way of organizing things that are just not defensive. And in my view, it's mainly the renewal of the planning debate is a way to go in that direction. Because you can frame, so I'm not good at that, but I think that you can communicate this thing about democratizing choices concerning way of life, style of living together. Building scenarios is a way to decide what kind of society we want to build in the sense of to have choices in terms of way of life. And the planning process, for me, it's mostly three things. It's first, having deliberation. It's second, gathering the having deliberation about the various options. So building scenarios and having deliberation. The second thing is gathering the data and organizing the curation of those scenarios. So ecological accounting will be absolutely crucial in that dimension, but that's not the only way. Of course, there is the formulation of the needs and so on. And the third thing, and I think that is the key institution, we need to fight for socialization of investment. Investment right now is completely driven by private choices, and that's the way our lives are shaped. And we need to have some say about this socialization of this orientation of investment. And that's the purpose of planning. So how do you socialize investment? There are in history many examples, but there are three main immediate ways. One way is to build public services. We know how to do that at the level and the national level. A second way is to have some state control about the strategic height of the economy. China is doing that, and that's a way to shape the kind of society that you want. And the third thing, of course, is to have some forms of control of the credit process. By socializing the credit process, you can decide to build that sector and not that sector, that kind of good and not that kind of good, without entering into productive decision, innovation decision at the micro level, which cannot be controlled effectively from the center. And I think that in those three dimensions, both deliberation and building scenarios, gathering data, ecological and social, and being able to distribute investment according to those scenarios, of course, the tech capabilities are something that are changing completely the planning debate. The planning debate in the 20th century was a lot about the knowledge, the issue of knowledge. And we learned from that moment that there were problems of information gathering, there was problem of articulation and structuring that information. And many of those problems can, of course, be solved by current technologies. However, and that is also something very important, we need to be aware that we don't want to be just the automaton of that tech, of that planning process. So we need to think about the limits of that planning process itself. Limits vis-à-vis nature. So that's the reason why I am talking about this issue of ecological accounting, this idea of a permanent inventory of nature that will never be perfect, but the purpose of that is to set limits that we don't want to cross in order to preserve the autonomous movement of nature. And the second element, it's our own life. We don't want to have those own life completely automatized. So we are happy to have them curated by algorithm. We are happy to have better satisfaction of our needs thanks to this kind of coordination. But we want to preserve some forms of autonomy. So we need also to decide the limits of the planning process. And I think that around that could be framed as democratic lifestyles or democratizing lifestyle choices. There is something that could be invented from the left, and at least there are the materials elements to think about that.
Evgeny, last word. Does technology actually offer any processes for democratic investment and capital raising?
So I contest the paradigm. So let me just be very clear. It's an important cluster in a set of issues, so I think we definitely should tackle them. The question, I think, is a political question. How we should be framing the response to the legitimacy of the capitalist project. Whether we think about it as too late capitalism, organic capitalist, or something else, I do think it would be very hard to, maybe Cédric would disagree here, but I think that despite all of the systemic problems and all the systemic faults, an average person on the street, both in Europe and in the United States, is more of a believer in capitalism. No, I wouldn't say they're more of a believer in capitalism, but they're still a believer in capitalism. I don't think that giving them an option of a system that would plan better and more democratically would necessarily make them question their faith in the capitalist dogma. In part because I think capitalism today legitimizes itself slightly differently than it did in the 1930s or 1967. I'm not going to take you through the entirety of the socialist calculation debate, which Cédric was partly alluding to in his answer, but you surely know that there has been a long-running argument between socialist economists and capitalist economists as to how to best organize the economy. With socialists saying that, hey, we can plan or we can use some kind of market planning process, but ultimately it will be about allocating goods in a way that does not depend on competition or the market process. And the fact that we rely on the plan is going to result in a more rational, efficient, socially just allocation of resources. So it's an allocation problem that needs to be solved. Capitalists and people like Friedrich Hayek and Mises, who were very big participants in this debate, and later James Buchanan, they made the case essentially that no, the markets would do it better because socialism leads to gulags, and nonetheless, they cannot plan well how to allocate resources, so you will end up with a lot of waste and inefficiency, and you will not end up with all of the knowledge that circulates in the system, implicitly or explicitly, being utilized, so it will lead to subpar outcomes. So I would argue that until maybe early 1970s, the legitimacy of the capitalist project hung on this ability of the capitalist market to allocate things better because of all these various knowledge routes and its ability to utilize knowledge and allocate goods in ways that do not lead to the gulag, but also do not result in inferior technologies and inferior goods. I would argue that from early 1970s, there has been a shift in the legitimation strategy of the capitalist system versus a prospective and actually existing socialist one. And it has to do with rethinking the role that the market plays in democratic capitalism. And that has been to reconceptualize the market not as a more effective system for allocating goods, but as a state-like system for satisfying, or let me say like politics-like system for satisfying the deepest aspirations of consumers and entrepreneurs alike, and for allowing us to turn into more complex subjects by constantly experimenting with new techniques of production, new techniques of consumption, articulating new tastes, experimenting with different identities, and exercising some moderate degree of sovereignty in our role as both consumers and of creativity in our role as entrepreneurs. So for the period between, I would say, late 1970s until maybe 2010s, that has been one of the core legitimizing strategies of capitalism. So if you go and read people like James Buchanan, who got the Nobel Prize and is one of the kind of founding fathers of neoliberalism, he would tell you straight away towards the end of his life that he thinks that even if socialists manage to build computers and AI systems that would allow us to allocate goods more efficiently than the markets, they would still not be able to deliver on these promises for continuous self-reinvention and experiencing complexity that the market offers to both consumers and entrepreneurs. So by late 1990s, neoliberals and capitalists have more or less acknowledged that the reason why markets are better is because they coincide or overlap with the expectations that modern